15 meters. That is how much the water rises when the tide comes in. Not gradually, not gently. The bay empties, the bay fills, and the granite rock sitting in the middle becomes an island twice a day and a fortress the rest of the time. Mont-Saint-Michel. You know the postcard. The abbey on the rock, the spire pointing up through the mist. What you do not see in the photograph is the fact that the island was not always an island, that the coastline itself has been moving for 1,000 years, and that the entire site was designed around one thing, controlling who could reach it and when. The bay is not decoration, the bay is the machine, and the rock sitting in the middle is the switch. How did a monastery become one of the most successful military fortifications in European history if it was just a place of prayer? That is exactly what we are going to find out. The official story calls it an abbey, a pilgrimage site, a masterpiece of medieval faith built on a tidal outcrop off the coast of Normandy. That version is not wrong, it is incomplete. Because the same tides that made the mount famous also made it unconquerable, and the same isolation that drew monks in the 8th century turned the site into a prison after the French Revolution. The building changed, the coastline changed, the function changed, but the rock and the water stayed locked together. And everything that happened on that granite hill happened because of what the sea did twice a day. The story starts with a drowned forest, before the abbey, before the fortress, before the island. The bay was dry land. A granite hill called Mont-Saint-Michel rose above a forest of oak and beech. Ancient tree stumps still emerge from the sand at low tide. The forest drowned. The sea moved in. And the hill became a rock surrounded by water. That much is geology. What comes next is strategy. In the year 708, a bishop claimed he saw the archangel Michael in a vision and was told to build a sanctuary on the rock. A small chapel went up. Monks followed, and by the 10th century, the abbey was already a destination for pilgrims willing to cross the flats on foot during the few hours when the tide was low enough to allow it. The timing mattered. The bay is flat, the tidal range is extreme, and the water does not creep back in. It rushes. Witnesses described it moving as fast as a galloping horse. Anyone caught halfway across when the tide turned had two choices: run or drown. The sand itself was a trap. The bay is not solid ground. It is a mix of silt, quicksand, and unstable channels that shift with every storm. Pilgrims hired guides who knew the safe paths. Those who crossed alone often disappeared into the sand or were overtaken by the water. The mount was not easy to reach. That was the point. Isolation made it sacred, and isolation made it defensible. By the time the 100 Years' War began in 1337, Mont-Saint-Michel was no longer just a monastery. It was a fortress. The English controlled most of Normandy. They took the towns, they took the castles, they surrounded the mount, and they could not take it. The siege lasted 30 years. Not 30 days, 30 years. The English built a forward base on Tombelaine, a smaller, rocky islet less than 3 kilometers to the north. They positioned archers. They brought in siege equipment. They waited for the tide. And the tide destroyed them. Cannons sank into the sand. Supply wagons were swallowed by quicksand. Siege towers were washed away when the water came back in. The English tried to bombard the mount from a distance, but the ground would not hold the weight of the guns. In 1434, they brought 2 massive bombards across the flats. The weapons were too heavy. The sand was too soft. The guns sank. The tide came in. And the English abandoned them. Those 2 cannons are still there. They sit at the entrance to the mount today, not as relics of French victory, but as evidence that the bay itself was the primary defense. Inside the fortress, the French garrison numbered 119 knights. That is the documented strength. 119 men held a fortified rock against the English crown for 3 decades. They did not win because they were better soldiers. They won because the attackers could not stay. Every assault had to be timed to the tide. Every approach was visible for kilometers across the open flats. Every retreat was a race against the water. The Mount did not need a large army. It needed a calendar and a view. The design of the fortress reflected this. The walls were not built in concentric rings like a traditional castle. They followed the shape of the rock. The only entrance was a single gate at the base of the southern slope. From there, a narrow street called the Grande Rue zigzagged upward through the village. The street was not straight. It was designed to slow attackers and expose them to fire from above. At each turn, another gate, another choke point, another set of murder holes in the ceiling. If an enemy force made it through the outer gate, they would have to fight uphill in single file, while defenders rained arrows, stones, and boiling liquid from the ramparts. The street ended at the abbey itself. And the abbey was not separate from the fortress. It was the fortress. The monks lived in a structure called La Merveille, a 3-story Gothic masterpiece built directly into the northern face of the rock. But the same building that housed the cloister and the refectory also contained battlements, watchtowers, and walls thick enough to stop siege engines. The religious and the military were fused into the same stone. The roof of the church was a firing platform, the base of the abbey was a bunker, and the granite outcrop beneath it all was the foundation that made both possible. The rock itself is only 92 meters above sea level at its highest point, but in a flat bay with no other high ground for kilometers, 92 meters is enough. From the top of the abbey, you can see the entire tidal zone. You can see the channels where the water flows fastest. You can see the ridges of harder sand that form temporary paths at low tide. You can see anyone approaching from any direction. And you can see exactly how much time they have before the sea cuts them off. That visibility was the real weapon. The English could not surprise the Mount. They could not encircle it. They could not starve it out, as long as supply boats could reach the base of the rock at high tide. And they could not assault it without crossing the flats in full view of the defenders. The bay gave the French every advantage. But the bay was not stable. It was moving. The coastline around Mont-Saint-Michel has been shifting for centuries. Rivers carry sediment from inland Normandy and Brittany. The tides push it back and forth. And over time, the sand builds up. In the medieval period, the Mount was surrounded by water at high tide and accessible by foot at low tide. By the 19th century, the bay had silted up so much that the rock was becoming a peninsula. The sea still came in, but the sand stayed, and the island was slowly welding itself to the mainland. In 1879, the French government built a solid causeway to make access easier. The road worked, but it blocked the tidal flow. Sediment that would have been swept out to sea began piling up on both sides of the causeway. The bay filled in faster. Within decades, the Mount was an island in name only. At low tide, it sat in the middle of a flat plain of dry sand, stretching for kilometers in every direction. The postcard image survived, but the tidal machine was breaking. The problem was not just aesthetic, it was hydraulic. The bay depends on a massive volume of water moving in and out twice a day. That movement scours the sand and keeps the channels open. When the causeway blocked the flow, the scouring stopped. The sand accumulated. And the Mount began to lose the very thing that made it defensible: isolation. The French government realized the error, but reversing it required more than demolishing the causeway. It required re-engineering the entire tidal system. In 2006, construction began on a hydraulic dam across the Counon River. The dam does not stop the river, it stores it. At low tide, when the bay is empty, the dam releases the stored water all at once. The result is a man-made tidal surge that rushes across the flats and scours away the sediment. The dam works in tandem with a new bridge. The old causeway was solid. The new bridge is built on stilts. Water flows freely underneath. The tidal cycle is restored, and the Mount is an island again. But only because engineers are constantly intervening to keep it that way. Without the dam, the bay would silt up within a decade. Without the bridge, the causeway would block the flow again. And without both, the Mount would return to being a granite hill surrounded by sand instead of water. The island is not natural. It is maintained. and it has been maintained in one form or another for over 1,000 years. Because the value of the mount was never the rock. It was the access, or more precisely, the control of access. In the medieval period, that control was military. During the siege, the French used the tides to time supply runs. Boats would approach at high tide, unload at the base of the rock, and retreat before the water dropped. The English could see the boats, but they could not reach them. Their own vessels were stranded on the sand twice a day, and any attempt to approach the mount on foot during low tide meant crossing kilometers of open ground under fire from the ramparts. The tides were not just a defense, they were a weapon. The English learned this repeatedly. In 1433, they attempted a night assault during low tide. The plan was to cross the flats in darkness, scale the walls, and take the fortress before dawn. The attack failed. Not because the walls were too high, not because the defenders were too strong, but because the tide came in early. The assault force was caught halfway across the bay. Some drowned, some were captured, the rest retreated, and the English abandoned the idea of a direct assault. The tides were unpredictable enough to make any large-scale operation a gamble, and the French knew the patterns better than anyone. They had tide tables, they had local guides, and they had generations of experience reading the bay. The English had maps, but maps do not show quicksand. They do not show the invisible channels that fill first when the water returns, and they do not show the narrow windows of time when crossing is possible. The mount was defended by knowledge as much as by stone. After the war, the fortress became a symbol, a place that had never fallen, a rock that had held out when the rest of Normandy was occupied. But symbols do not stay static. By the time of the French Revolution, the monks were gone. The abbey was seized by the state, and the building that had once been a monastery and a fortress became a prison. The isolation that made it defensible made it perfect for detention. Prisoners could not escape. There was no tunnel to dig, no wall to scale, no forest to disappear into. There was only the bay. And the bay was a moat that refilled itself twice a day. The prison operated from 1793 to 1863. At its peak, it held over 600 inmates. Political prisoners. Priests who refused to swear loyalty to the new government. Common criminals. They were housed in the same halls where monks had once prayed. The cells were cold. The food was minimal. And the psychological weight of being surrounded by water with no hope of crossing it broke more men than the physical conditions. The prison closed after 70 years, not because of reform, but because the tide was no longer enough. Steam-powered boats could reach the mount regardless of the water level. The causeway was under construction, and the isolation that had made the site valuable as a prison was disappearing. The mount returned to being a tourist site, but the infrastructure remained. The gates, the walls, the narrow street, the battlements, and the 2 English cannons still sitting in the sand. The building is a palimpsest. Every layer of its history is still visible. The 8th century chapel, the 10th century abbey, the 14th century fortress additions, the 19th century prison modifications, and the 21st century hydraulic system, keeping the whole thing surrounded by water. But what nobody mentions is that the site only works because the landscape is constantly managed. The dam flushes the bay. The bridge allows the tides to flow, and engineers monitor the sediment levels to make sure the island stays an island. The postcard version shows a timeless monument. The technical version shows a machine that requires constant intervention to preserve the illusion of permanence. And that is the real story of Mont-Saint-Michel. It was never just an abbey. It was never just a fortress. It was a piece of infrastructure designed to exploit the one feature of the landscape that could not be replicated anywhere else. A tidal range extreme enough to turn a rock into an island twice a day, and a fortress the rest of the time. The monks built on it because isolation meant sanctity. The French defended it because isolation meant invincibility. The revolutionaries imprisoned people on it because isolation meant control. And modern France maintains it because isolation is what tourists pay to see. But the isolation is not natural, it is engineered. The tides are managed, the coastline is sculpted, and the island itself is the product of a hydraulic system that has been running, in one form or another, since the first causeway was laid across the sand. The official history treats Mont-Saint-Michel as a monument that survived because of its beauty and its spiritual significance. The engineering history treats it as a site that survived because it was unreachable when it needed to be and accessible when it chose to be. Both are true, but only one explains why a garrison of 119 men could hold a rock for 30 years against the English crown. Only one explains why two massive cannons are still sitting in the sand after 6 centuries. And only one explains why the French government spent millions of euros building a dam and a bridge to keep a medieval abbey surrounded by water. Because the value was never the building, it was the bay. And the building only mattered because it controlled the bay. The rock was the switch. The tide was the power, and the people who lived on that rock understood something that the people attacking it did not. You do not fight the sea. You use it. You time your supply runs to the tide. You position your watchtowers where they can see the channels. You let the quicksand swallow the siege engines. You let the water wash away the assault forces. And you wait, because the bay will do the work for you. That is what the English never understood. They treated the mount like a castle, a static fortification that could be besieged, surrounded, and starved into submission. But Mont-Saint-Michel was not static. It changed twice a day. The same route that was dry sand in the morning was deep water by evening. The same approach that was safe at low tide was lethal 6 hours later. And the same rock that looked isolated and vulnerable from the shore was connected to the sea in ways that made it untouchable. The fortress did not win because of its walls. It won because of its position, and its position only mattered because of the tides. Without the tidal range, the mount would have been just another hill, easy to surround, easy to isolate, easy to take. But the tides made it a clock, and the clock controlled everything. When you could approach, when you had to retreat, when supplies could arrive, when attacks were possible. The entire rhythm of life on the mount was dictated by the moon, not by the church bells, not by the military schedule, by the lunar cycle and the water it pulled across the bay twice a day. That is the part that does not make it into the guidebooks. The part where the abbey, the fortress, and the prison were all secondary to the landscape. The building was impressive, but the bay was the reason the building mattered. And the bay is still the reason people visit. They come to see the rock surrounded by water. They come to watch the tide rush in. They come to walk across the flats at low tide and feel the sand shift under their feet. They come because the site still behaves like a tidal machine. And the machine is still running. The dam releases its surge, the bridge lets the water through, and twice a day the rock becomes an island again. Not because it always was, but because someone decided it always should be. The stone remembers what the water taught it, and the water is still teaching.